Hello there. Thank you for joining us today. The show is called Birding with Lois, and I'm Lois Richter, so I am your host. We have a lot of things that we talk about on this show, and today we're going to be talking, a bit about naming, and then a bit about, lumping and splitting a bunch of other stuff. But first, I want to show you this picture. And this is a picture showing an eBird bio, I guess you'd call it. And it tells this person and where he has been in the world and how many places he's had birds. Look at that. All those countries that he's had birding in. Well, his name is Joseph Morlan. And I want to say, welcome, Joseph.
Thank you, Lois.
And today we're going to talk about a lot of things. He has agreed to an open conversation. I love that. So, as most of you know, birds exist, and the various birds are different species. And so, a species of a bird is, Joseph, what's a species?
Yeah, there's a number of different species concepts that have been proposed. And the one that's used for birds is mostly the biological species concept, which is based on reproductive compatibility. That is, whether or not they can breed successfully with each other. If they cannot breed successfully with each other, then they are considered to be separate species. If they do, and then they are considered to be the same species. That does not work with every kind of organism. For example, asexually reproducing organisms makes no sense to have reproductive compatibility. I'm compatible with myself. I can reproduce by myself. That doesn't exactly explain things. So there have been a number of other species concepts that have been proposed, including the phylogenetic species concept. And when you hear somebody talking about the phylogenetic species concept, be very, very worried, because that's going to get you into a whole lot of trouble if you start to use that in bird watching. So right now there's something like 11,000 species of birds that are currently recognized, and that's based on the biological species concept. If you want to go with a phylogenetic species concept, that is where every population that is diagnosable becomes a species. Then you're going to end up tripling the number of species or even more that you have in the world. And some people might like that, because some people have a life list and they're anxious to get new birds. So when somebody splits something, they're all excited, and when somebody lumps them, they hate it. So I'm sorry.
You're getting a little technical in some of that stuff, the philo whatever it is. Are you talking about identifying birds by DNA instead of by who they hang out with or who they have families with?
No. A phylogenetic species concept is based on there is a genetic component to it, and you can make these charts that have little ends to them. And the ones that are closely related to each other form what's called a clade. I don't know quite how to explain all of that. But
and it probably isn't necessary for most people who are doing birding.
Okay.
I mean, is it? I mean, that it's not used in our current method of assigning names, is it?
Well, cladism is used to evaluate the genetics of birds and see which ones are more closely related, and whether or not sometimes that might affect whether or not they're classified as full species. But the part where the biological species concept falls apart is when the populations are geographically isolated from each other.
I'm thinking of the scrub jays.
Yeah, the scrub jays are a great example of that.
Florida scrub jays, western scrub jays, island scrub jays, and they're all scrub jays.
And the western scrub jay has been split now. I don't know if you knew that. The California scrub jay is the current scrub jay that we have here in California. And it's been split from the Woodhouse's jay that's found in the Great Basin region.
I've never even heard of a Woodhouse's jay.
Oh, you've got to keep up with this stuff because it comes out every year. The AOS.
So they used to be, they used to all be Western scrub jays?
They used to be Western scrub jays, and then there was the island scrub jay. That was one of the first ones that got split out. And then the Florida scrub jay got split out shortly after that, I think. And so we had the Western scrub jay, the Florida scrub jay, and the island scrub jay. Island scrub jay is found only on I think it's Santa Cruz Island, off the channel, one of the Channel Islands in Southern California. And it's a big scrub jay. You go there, you have to go to this island to see that bird. It's about 50% larger than the scrub jays that are on the mainland.
Is that another situation where isolation came into play and they just diverged?
Well, when you have geographic isolation, you have a unit of evolution because it's not connected to any other population, closely related population. So it cannot interbreed with it, but also it's likely, especially if it's a small population on an island, it's likely to diverge rather rapidly sometimes. Evolution is thought to take place over millennia, but we're learning now that evolution can take place over much shorter periods of time. There was a fascinating study on the house sparrow, which I'm not sure I should go into. But,
please don't. That one is way too complicated.
Okay.
But I will say I heard a rumor. I'll confirm it with you that all of the house sparrows, most of the house sparrows in the world, all came from one population and were distributed around the world on sailing ships. Is that accurate?
I don't think so.
Okay.
That's not what I heard.
Then what did you hear?
Well, house sparrows were introduced independently across the United States, and so they didn't all come from one, separate, distinctive population, and that landed on sailing ships. But what I wanted to tell you was that a very clever zoologist took a look at the current distribution of house sparrows in the Americas and found that the ones in the north were larger than the ones in the south, and the ones in the moister areas had darker plumage than the ones in the deserts. And these follow general geographic rules for warm-blooded vertebrates called Gloger's rule and Bergman's rule. Bergman's rule suggests that the sizes of warm-blooded vertebrates are larger when the climate is cold and smaller when it's yes, because the bigger you are, the more body warmth you can maintain.
And if the smaller ones die off, then you're only left with big ones.
Exactly. That's exactly natural selection. But there's the other aspect of this is the surface area per unit volume. If you are a large animal, your amount of surface area per unit volume becomes smaller, right?
You lose less heat.
You lose less heat if you're large. If you're a tiny little bird, you're going to lose a lot of heat. And there's a minimum amount that a bird can be and still be warm-blooded. That small amount is pretty much in your hummingbirds that you want to talk about later. The Cuban hummingbird, the bee hummingbird, is the smallest bird in the world.
You said and still be warm-blooded. We don't have any cold-blooded birds, do we?
Well, the birds are capable of going torpid in cold weather. Some of the birds do. Swifts and hummingbirds are famous for doing that.
Okay, so let's get back. Boy, we are going to have such a wildly divergent discussion. I love it.
Okay.
So let's get back to the birds that can make a family together are one species. But then you said the western scrub jay has been divided in two. They could make a family together if they were together, couldn't they?
We would have to look at the zone of contact to see whether or not they were interbreeding with each other. If they were interbreeding with each other, they would form what's called a hybrid swarm. and all of the birds in the contact zone, or let's say 95% of the birds in the contact zone, would show characters intermediate between the two types. If you see a hybrid swarm, that is an indication that there's free gene flow between those populations, and they are not discriminating against each other for mate choice.
So they're one species.
So they would be all one species.
Okay.
So, and in the case of the scrub jays, we basically do not know because they are geographically isolated. The one in Florida has no chance to mate with one in California.
Right.
So it is going to be a matter of a taxonomist's opinion based on similar birds and genetic differences of similar types of birds that are known to either be subspecies or species, whether or not they want to elevate them to a separate species or not.
The western scrub jay that got split up, is that because there's a population that is over the mountains?
Yes,
I don't know about this.
Yeah, the California scrub jay is found on this side of the Sierra Nevada, but it also spreads over onto the Nevada side of the Sierra Nevada in the north. And in the southern part, there is this contact zone, probably around Mono County, where you start to pick up the woodhouse jay, which is a much duller version of the scrub jay, and it extends all the way down into southern Nevada and much of the southern Great Basin. But
and when was that species created? When was that made a species?
It was always a species. It wasn't recognized as a species until the AOS published it.
Right.
And my friend John Dunn was involved. He and Kimball Garrett did quite a bit of work on this. And there's been other research by ornithologists over the years. And the contact zone is rather poorly defined, but there does not seem to be a hybrid swarm in there. The year that happened, I can't tell you, but I think it was a couple years ago at least.
Okay. And how does one know when something has been lumped or split or renamed? How do you know?
Okay, you find out once a year when the AOS publishes a supplement to the AOS checklist. The AOS is the American Ornithological Societies, and they have a committee on taxonomy and nomenclature which publishes a checklist of the birds of North America. And the current edition is the 7th edition. But once a year, usually in July, they will publish a supplement. And you can go online and you can see what proposals have been made and you can make a proposal. If you want to, anybody can go in there and, hey, I
want the hummingbird in my backyard to be split off and called the Lois's hummingbird.
Well, you can
Is that
go ahead.
going to fly?
It might fly, but it's not going to get accepted. But sure, no. I actually submitted a proposal to the committee that was accepted at one point, having to do with the scientific name of a bird in Hawaii. But
so we have the what is that? That's the website.
That's an IOC.
You want to put that up for men?
Okay, yeah, let's take a look at that.
So just so that people know, it does exist on the web a place you can go look for things. Okay, that's enough.
Well, that's the IOC World Bird List.
Yeah.
And that is one of 3 competing world checklists.
Oh, we're going to get to competition now. Okay, now that was a little downer on our list, but that's okay. We can do that now. So what are the 3 competing world bird checklists?
There's the Clements checklist, which was just updated the other day. And that, you want to show that one?
Yeah, there we go.
That's the Clements checklist, and this you can download a full spreadsheet of all of the birds in the world from both of those sites. The Clements checklist is North American centered and is run out of Cornell University. It also has an association with a South American checklist committee that is working on South American birds. The IOC, which is the one that you showed earlier, is a outcome from an international ornithological community or international ornithological club, I guess it's called, that had a conference some decades ago in New Zealand. And what they decided to do was to have a committee agree on the English names for all the birds in the world, so that the U.S. name would be the same for the same species that was found in, say, New Zealand or Australia or China or whatever. So wherever the bird occurred, there would be a standard agreed upon English name for every bird in the world. And they got the best ornithologists and taxonomists from all around the world on all of these different countries. And they could not agree on what English names to use for those birds. And almost all of them quit after a year and a half or so, and they were making very little progress. But we got at least one American on there who is not affiliated with the AOS checklist or the Clements checklist. And they managed to proceed together, and they put together this checklist, which is what they decided to use. And that checklist is what's used by birders in Britain for the most part, and in Europe. So there's been okay.
Okay, so I'm getting a little confused. You said this thing got started and they couldn't agree, and most of them left, but there was one birder left, and so he got to decide? Is that
well, I don't know the full details on that, but they've got a bunch of people. They have quite a large committee that still participates in this whole thing. And what they were unable to do was to get Americans and Brits to agree on how you spell gray, for example. So is gray petrel Grey, or is it Gray? Now, we're going to have a standard that's in use all around the whole world, and the Brits and the Americans cannot possibly agree on whether or not it's spelled gray.
So you call it pale black?
Well, you could call it anything you like, but nobody is going to agree with you. You have to get a consensus, and there was never a consensus about how to spell certain names. The other thing that they refused to agree on is whether or not to put hyphens in the names. So we have black-crowned night heron, and they have black-crowned night heron, but they have no hyphens. Well, I think they don't hyphenate night heron. I'm not sure if they. They probably do hyphenate black crown, but not night heron. So we couldn't ever get an agreement on how to deal with hyphens. Anyway, there is an effort to get at least the taxonomy in agreement, because once they realized that they had to come up with an English name for every bird in the world, they also had to agree on how many species there are and which species to recognize. So that a lot of times a bird that's found in New Zealand and found in Australia, the red-billed gull is found in New Zealand, and the silver gull is found in Australia, and they're almost identical in appearance, but they've always been considered separate species. And I think they've just recently been lumped, actually.
But they're two different islands.
Yeah.
Two different populations.
Right. They look almost identical, though.
So when you say taxonomy, let's clarify that in case we have any new birders around. A taxonomy is, as I understand it, a usually two-word name, frequently Latin or Greek, and it describes a genus and a species.
Okay, that's nomenclature. That's nomenclature. Nomenclature and taxonomy are the twins of each other. Nomenclature is the art or science of naming, And taxonomy is the relationships between the taxa. A taxon can be any category you care for, like a species or a subspecies or a family or a superfamily, an order. That is the study of taxon. That's what taxonomy is. So, all right, I'm not happy with this light. All right.
Okay. So, so you're talking about the actual animals, and I'm saying, but don't they have names?
Yeah, and the names that you were talking about is called binomial nomenclature, and that
And
got
is that
that
accepted? Is that
yeah, that started with Linnaeus, and everybody agrees on that. That goes back to like the 16th century, I think, or maybe earlier than that, with one publication by Linnaeus, in which he listed all of the species of animals and plants that he knew about, and he used a binomial system. Prior to that, they had no organized system for naming, giving the scientific names of these birds. They
so you say everybody agrees on
Everybody agrees there's a genus, and that is a Latinized name, and that's the group that the bird belongs to. And all members of a genus are believed to have evolved from a common ancestor.
okay. And then the species within the genus, you can think of those as cousins, right?
The
They share a common ancestor?
They share a common ancestor, yeah, the genus. And then the species is never capitalized, and it follows the genus. So it's binomial. It's two names. A genus, Setophaga, which is a North American warbler, and then Dendroica, which would be a yellow-rumped warbler, for example, would be the scientific name of it. Now, most of us do not use scientific names when we are out bird watching. Some people might, but most of us do not remember the scientific names of all of the birds.
But that comes into play when you go to record what you've seen. I know that I use eBird to record what I've seen, and you say it's a blank blank warbler, and they say it's a blank blank with the Latin stuff.
Well, they give both. They give when you enter your data into eBird, you don't have to enter in the Latin stuff. You just have to enter in the English name, and it'll pick up the Latin name for you. So what it comes in handy is if you're corresponding with people in other languages, that the scientific name is going to be the same throughout the world. I could be corresponding with an ornithologist in China, and I wouldn't understand a thing that he was writing. But as soon as we pick up Setophaga dendroica, we'll know exactly what we're talking about, because that is universal.
Okay, so when I'm talking, I'm going to come back to the scrub jays, because they're easy to understand. So we have these western scrub jays. What's the Latin name for that genus or species?
Darned if I know. No, I don't know these.
When they split off the island from the California, did they assign new Latin binomial names?
Yeah, when you split it off, it stays in the same genus. They're all definitely in the same genus, and I cannot remember off the top of my head what the genus is for the scrub jay. But Californica, I think, is the scientific name or the specific name, sometimes called the specific epithet. It follows.
That does not sound good, does it?
No, it doesn't. You never heard the term epithet used in a good way, but that's what it's called. It's the species part of the name. And then there was another name that was used for the island scrub jay, but those names follow what's called international rules of zoological nomenclature. And the only valid name for anything is a is a name that has priority. That is the first person to name that bird within a binomial system.
In any system? I mean, any binomial system?
There's only one binomial system. It's binomial nomenclature. It consists of a genus and a species. And if a ornithologist or anybody published a description of a bird or a plant or a fish or whatever it was and used a binomial name for it, that name is the one that is valid because he was the first one to do that. If somebody else came along and said, well, this fish is actually this, but he wasn't aware that somebody pre-published that, you can see how this could be a mess if people around the world aren't necessarily aware of what other people have published. So you have to have what's called synonymy. And you take a look at these things, and every single bird species has a long list of synonyms. And these are invalid names which have been used in the past. So it is the earliest name which is recognized. Unless...
How can you possibly know which one is the earliest if they're in two different places? If this person over here says, there's that bird and here's the name, and this other person says, there's that bird and here's that name, and they're two different countries, they're two different places, how can you possibly know who was first?
Well, you would know once you realize that the bird being described in one country was the same thing that's already been described from another country. And that would be on the basis of specimens, for example. You can compare specimens. In general, birds are not described unless there is a specimen in a museum, in a recognized museum that you can go to, and that's called the type specimen. So when you have a type specimen, you can compare the bird from whatever other country with the type, and if it matches, then you can say that's the same bird. Now, today, we would also probably want to do genetic studies to make sure that they are genetically the same bird or close to being the same bird. They might be another subspecies.
We haven't even gotten to subspecies.
Yeah,
is that a third name?
Yeah, you would put a third name on there, and that might be the subspecies.
So we're talking about yellow-rumped warbler. I have audubons and I have myrtles, and sometimes it's all one thing, and sometimes they're separate species, and sometimes they're subspecies.
Right. And I think I gave you the wrong name for the yellow-rumped warbler, which is Setophaga coronata, not dendroica. And coronata could be a subspecies, and that would be the myrtle warbler. And I'm not sure, it might be auduboni or something like that for the western type, which is the one with the yellow throat. They used to be considered separate species, but they got lumped back probably, 20 years ago, I think,
Haven't they been split up again?
No.
Okay.
A lot of people would like them to be split up, but it's not happening.
Well, I mean, they are so distinctly, it's so easy to tell one from the other.
Yeah, you can tell them apart.
The ones with the yellow is the audubons. The ones with the white is the myrtles.
Yeah, the white-throated is the myrtles, and the yellow-throated one is the audubons. And here's the thing. They don't care, because in Alberta, there's a hybrid swarm.
And which color throat do they have?
They have a mixture.
You mix white and yellow, you get yellow.
No. You have patches of yellow on white. You have, there's also some differences in their facial pattern, like the shape of the patch is different on the two, and you get intermediates on those. Okay. One has a stronger supercilium and the other doesn't. So those birds are phenotypically intermediate. Also, a lot of them can resemble, say, a pure Audubon's warbler, but genetically they might turn out to be hybrids also. Right. So anyway.
Let's talk about a couple of birds that you had had us get pictures of. Glenn, could
Okay.
you put up that first picture? That is a black-shouldered kite. Wait a minute, is that the right one? Is that the first picture? A black-shouldered kite in India is what this one was labeled.
Yeah, I took this picture in India, and it looks a whole lot like the white-tailed kite that we have here in California. But for a long time, they were considered to be separate species. And then somebody decided that it was better to consider them all one species.
We have
And
another picture from Tanzania.
Yeah,
And is that supposed to be the same species?
that's the same species as the one from India, the black-shouldered kite. The old world birds have shorter tails. They tend not to hover the way our birds do. So their behavior is different, and their tail length in particular is quite a bit different. The ones we have here have much longer tails.
So let's look at the next one. That is a white-shouldered. No, white-tailed.
No, white-tailed kite.
This is ours, right?
Yeah, this is the one that I probably photographed this down at Palo Alto Baylands, I think. You can see well, you can't really see that it's hovering, but trust me, it was hovering. And it can't really see that the tail is white, but the tail is white on both species. Look, they both have a black shoulder. They both have a white tail. Those are just English names for these two birds, which are now considered to be separate species. But let me explain what happened. And that is, okay, that's the same. There you can see the white tail on the on that one. And there's similar birds in Australia. There's one called the letter-winged kite that occurs in Australia, which is a different species from both of those. Anyway, the idea that they should be lumped was based without reference to interbreeding, because the ones that we have here in California get nowheres near India or Africa. So there's no way you can test whether or not they would hybridize if they came into contact, if they're so isolated geographically. But there was this theory that when two similar types of birds are found around the world and they do not overlap, that it is preferable to consider them to be subspecies than it is to consider them to be separate species. Why? Because by considering them to be separate subspecies, you are using nomenclature to tell people two things. One, they are very closely related, which you can certainly see, I think. That's certainly a valid point. The black-shouldered kite in India and Tanzania is clearly closely related to the white-tailed kites of California. And it tells you that they are allopatric. What does
allopatric?
What does allopatric mean? It means that their ranges do not overlap. They do not have overlapping ranges. And that is one of the things that's special about subspecies, is subspecies cannot have overlapping ranges with another subspecies. Why? Because they would hybridize if they came into contact. And so you cannot have two subspecies in the same area. But what about those warblers? What about that yellow-rumped warbler that we just talked about? We have probably, you could go into my yard and I could find both the Audubon's type and the myrtle type. So how can they possibly just be subspecies? Anybody know? You don't know. Okay, that's fine.
I'm going to guess it has to be DNA.
It has to be the breeding grounds. They cannot overlap on their breeding grounds, but on the wintering grounds, they can overlap. Why? Because on the wintering grounds, they're not mating. There is a
Okay.
barrier to gene flow on the wintering grounds because there is no breeding going on the wintering grounds. So on the wintering grounds, you can have these subspecies overlap, but not on the breeding grounds. So in the summertime, when we go around looking at yellow-rumped warblers in California, they're all Audubons. You cannot find a myrtle warbler in California during the summer months. You have to go all the way to Alaska or Labrador to find a myrtle warbler in the breeding season.
Okay. All right. So I want to look at two birds that are different, and then have you tell me about what's different about them. You can go ahead and turn that light off if you want. We don't really need it.
Let me see if I can get rid of it.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
I think that's better.
So let's put up a Bullock's Oriole. Now, you sent me two pictures. This is the drab version, and then the next one is the bright version. Let's go back to the drab version. Now, what is that?
Well, that's a female Bullock's Oriole.
It's a female. So it's a male-female difference in color pattern here.
Yeah, it's called sexual dimorphism. Mm-hmm. And in many birds, the males are kind of showy and the females are drab. And there's an evolutionary explanation for that, and that is that the females want to avoid being eaten. While
she stays home, sits on the nest, does the work. He goes out there and has a good time.
Well, what he does is he wants to be noticed. And if he is very sharp looking, that females may believe that he has more fitness or that he's just more interesting, I guess. I don't want to put my brain inside that of what a female Bullock's Oriole is thinking, but this is the strategy that is evolved for quite a few species. But there are many species that do not have sexual dimorphism, like those scrub jays. You go around looking at scrub jays, and the only way you can't really tell which one's the male or the female. They look identical, and that is a fairly another strategy that is fairly common. You know what we've learned though is that actually the scrub jays have different colors in the ultraviolet spectrum. And that if you look at them in ultraviolet, the males have all of this ultraviolet and the females don't. And I think that their eyes are capable of seeing into the ultraviolet spectrum, that they're seeing colors that we cannot see. And that the male and female scrub jays may in fact look rather different if you were a scrub jay than if you're a human. They look the same, but to a scrub jay, they might look quite different.
I'm going to ask if the crew can put up Joseph and the bird side by side, or Joseph and me, and if you can put him up with that bird, that would be lovely. Now, this is the male Bullock's Oriole, and I want to see that, or just put the bird up, that's fine. Okay, male Bullock's Oriole. And then let's see the next slide. That should be a different Oriole. Now notice the head on, oops. Okay, next slide. So that is a different head pattern than the male Bullock's Oriole. What is this?
This is the Baltimore Oriole, and this replaces the Bullock's Oriole in the eastern half of the United States. And you can see it has an all-black head. And there are other differences in the wing pattern as well. These birds have been expanding their ranges in the Great Plains, where there are trees growing up along the east-west rivers. So particularly along the Platte River, for example, in Nebraska, as the trees grew up, the Baltimore Orioles, which you see here, expanded from the eastern part of their range towards the west, where they met up with Bullock's Orioles that were breeding on the other end of the Platte River. And when they first came into contact, they hybridized like mad. There was no way they could tell each other apart. They were happy to breed with whichever female came along. And are you hearing that? I'm
Yes.
sorry. I've got to turn this off. I'm sorry. Okay. So because of that, the ornithologist looked at the zone of contact and said, well, there is no reproductive isolation at all.
So they must be the same species.
They must be the same species. And they went ahead and they said, based on the data that we have, they have now come into contact and they are mating randomly with each other. So they must be the same species, and they created the northern oriole. And that's what this bird was called for probably over a decade back in the day. I don't know if you remember that.
I was never in the East, so I wasn't in contact with Baltimore oriole or northern oriole.
Well, northern oriole was the name that the Bullock's oriole used to have.
Oh. So even though they look so different, they said, well, if they can breed together, they must be the same bird.
Exactly. It doesn't matter how different they look. It's whether or not we're not going to make the decision. We're going to let the birds make the decision whether or not they feel that they are separate species or not. It's the biology of the birds. And that's why it's called the biological species concept. So that's what happened there. And then guess what happened? 10 years later,
split them?
10 years later, they went back to the same place where these birds were hybridizing, and they weren't hybridizing anymore. They were still separate species, and the hybrids had become very scarce. In fact, they found that the hybrids were at a selective disadvantage in finding mates, so that they had pure Bullocks in the same area as pure Baltimores. And there were still a few hybrids around, but those hybrids had a lot of difficulty finding mates of either species. So during that period of time, the birds had evolved a mechanism to prevent hybridization. And they also have different songs, somewhat different call notes, and all of those come into play with these birds in the contact zone. And this is something that's perhaps not unreasonable to expect. That is birds that used to be allopatric become sympatric, and there has not been time enough for them to evolve what's called an isolating mechanism to prevent them from hybridizing. So we jumped the gun on it and said they're breeding together, so they must be one species, northern oriole, and that's what it was for a good 10 years or more until they split them again, and then they went back to the old names, Baltimore oriole, which is what's on the screen next to me, and the Bullock's oriole, which is the one that we have here in California.
So if I'm a birder and now you've split them up, now I get two birds if I see both.
If you see both, you have to see both. Yeah.
Right. Of course. I can't record I've seen it. If I haven't seen it, I know.
Okay, good.
But it's very obvious in the males. Can we see the females and see what the distinctions and differences there are? There is
this is a female of a Baltimore oriole, and you can see that it's got this orangey color. It's got a little dark patch on its face. It's more orange on the breast, and it extends further down on the belly than the female Bullock's oriole. The female Bullock's oriole also has a slightly different. Can you pull up the female?
There it is.
Yeah.
Much whiter on the belly.
Yeah. It's yellow on this, and it's much more obviously so. Also, you see a little dark line through the eye. That gives it a kind of meaner expression on its face, I think, compared to the Baltimore oriole. So the females are also reasonably different. There's the female Baltimore. You can see some dark scaling on its back also that we don't see on the Bullock's Oriole, which had a plain gray back. Also, you see that front wing bar? That one has a bunch of little notches in it. And I think that the Bullock's Oriole females don't have quite that same pattern. So anyway, there's a bunch of differences.
Okay, so when I'm looking at these pictures and I'm not seeing the real bird, and I think let's just do Joseph and I for a while. When I'm looking at those, I notice that in the photographs that the one is skinny and one is fluffy, but that's just the posture of the bird, isn't it?
Yeah, you can go down rabbit holes looking at photos because they just grab the bird in one particular pose. And my bird is very sleek looking and the other one was all hunched up. You have to take that into account. There are some slight differences in shape between these two species. But not as extravagant as what the photos would seem to show. And in fact, we did not see that shape in the male Baltimore Oriole that we saw.
He wasn't hunched up. Yeah.
He wasn't hunched up. That's all that was.
Let's talk about a few other things. I know we have some more birds that you wanted to show us the differences about, but first let's talk about some of the resources that people have for identifying birds. We know that the eBird is a place that we can put in our lists, but they also collect photographs. And so people have photographs of stuff. And then on the All About Birds, that's another website where people can get lots of information. That's actually one of my favorites because it'll help you identify something if you don't know what the heck it is. And then we have a new thing called Birds of the World. And this is something new put out with the Cornell University. And there was a wonderful presentation by a woman who's in charge of this, and I'm hoping I can get her to come on the show and talk about it. This is a subscription thing. This is not a free thing, but it's a very interesting place. Let's ask you about the California Bird Records Committee and its role. Now we have eBird. Why do we need this other thing? Let's see that picture there. This is the website. Okay, and you can put that down. So what is this? What does it do? And is it still relevant?
Well, I'm the webmaster.
You're the one who asked that question. I took that from your comment.
Okay, all right, that's fair enough. The California Bird Records Committee got started in about 1970 or so, 71, I believe. And what it was a system followed up by a system in the British Birds Records Committee or British Rarities Committee. And what they did in Britain was they set up this panel for peer reviewing site records of rarities. And they had a list of birds that are rare for Britain and Ireland, and they would ask people to submit documentation, and then they would vote on whether or not that record was acceptable. Now, back in the 70s, not everybody had a digital camera on their phone or anywhere else, and we got very few photographs of these birds. But that's what we did. We tried to follow the British system of peer review. That is, we picked out 10 or 9 of the best birders in California, and one of them became the secretary, and he was in charge of gathering together all of the documentation. So back in those days, what we did was, if we saw a rare bird, we would immediately pull out a notebook and start sketching the bird, writing down detailed feather-by-feather descriptions of what it is that we saw through our binoculars or our spotting scope, and then we would write it up and submit that to the secretary, and then it would get a record number, and then it would be mailed via the post office to the 10 members of the committee, and each member would look at it and comment on whether or not he thought that the record was valid. He would give his reasons why he thought it was valid or not valid, and then it would be sent on to the next person, and eventually it would circulate back to the secretary, and he would tabulate the votes, and then we would find out how many votes it got. And if it got unanimous accept votes, it would be accepted. If it got one reject vote, it would still be accepted. And if it got two reject votes, but more than 5 reject votes, then it would go around again to see if we could get a consensus one way or another on that particular record. The purpose of this was to try to give as scientific as possible, validity to people's site records. So you see, I mean, we have birders of all different skill levels going around making all kinds of outrageous claims. And somebody said they saw, 10 whooping cranes in the Calusa National Wildlife Refuge. Well, this is ridiculous, I mean, it might seem to be ridiculous, but how do you know? What kind of documentation does he have for those whooping cranes? I mean, some stuff is just ridiculous. Other stuff is just incompetent. That is, somebody might see a good bird, but they don't have the skills, the requisite skills to be able to write a convincing description of what it is that they saw. Other people can make a convincing description out of something they never even saw, just to try to fool the records committee. Believe me, this has happened.
You were on this committee for what, 30 years or so, and did you end up being the chairman or the clerk or whatever?
I ended up being the chair. I was never the secretary. We kind of split the job of the original secretary between the chair and the secretary. It was a non-voting secretary, is what it is right now. But the secretary could be a voting member. It just hasn't been that way for quite a while. It's usually a non-voting secretary.
And is this still happening? I mean, is this organization still doing things?
Yeah, it still goes on. And if you see a bird that's on our review list, and the review list has just been slashed in about to half, so there aren't very many. But if you went and saw that willow warbler that was hanging around Rodeo Lagoon last week, you should either, get photos, but also write a description of the best you can, and you can submit it on a form that's available on this website. And the committee definitely wants to find out, what it is that you think about that bird. Now, everybody has called it a willow warbler, but is it really a willow warbler? We know that it's in the genus Philoscopus, but there are a whole bunch of other warblers that are in that same genus that are found in the Old World that most of us know nothing about. Right. And the fact that some people identified this as a willow warbler is, subject to some scrutiny. These are not obvious identifications. There's also a wood warbler, and also in the same genus in Southern California. That's the same thing. The committee, for really rare birds, the committee wants you to participate in the committee. Now, some people say the committee's too old-fashioned and we don't need that anymore. We have eBird.
That's what I'm going to ask you about, because I know that when I was back visiting in Wisconsin, I misidentified a bird, and I got a phone call going, "Did you really see that bird? If you did, this is going to be a real rarity for Wisconsin." Turns out, no, it wasn't. That wasn't the bird, but I had thought it was something because I was familiar with the something, and it looked really close. And so why is that eBird committee, I guess I'll call it a committee, why isn't that replacing what you've got?
Well, we do scan what comes through eBird. Mm-hmm. So this is at a higher level than what eBird does. eBird does the preliminary pruning, I guess, of what it is. You can put any bird out there on eBird, and if it's unconfirmed, if it's on a review list, it's unconfirmed, it doesn't count. So the eBird reviewers make a quick judgment, and sometimes they'll get to you. I've had a bunch of stuff where eBird reviewers were questioning my own sightings, and that is a very good thing. But sometimes it takes a long time for that to happen. I mean, I had seabirds that I put into eBird, years ago. And 5 years later, here comes this eBird reviewer who wants to know if I have details on some sighting that I did, on a ship, at sea, so many years ago. And I wish that they would have been a little bit more forthcoming. But this is a volunteer project. eBird does have professionals, but the eBird reviewers are all volunteered. They are unpaid. The same is true of the California Bird Records Committee. They are all volunteers, and they do this work because they believe that it's important. It's important to have a certain level of security about which records are valid and which ones are questionable. So the thing is, whenever you do this kind of work, you do not make a lot of friends. Nobody sends you a bouquet of flowers because you rejected their record. Tell me about it. I used to run a rare bird alert here in the Bay Area. It was a telephone thing where you could call in every day and find out what rare birds were seen. This was before the days of the internet. And when I called people up and said, well, how did you know that was a so-and-so? A lot of times they were just not real thrilled to be given a ruthless grilling, which is what they thought it was. But that's not what it was. I was just trying to see whether or not the thing should go on the rare bird alert. Anyway.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to ask you one last question before we move off here, and that is, when Europeans went around and named birds for themselves, instead of using the bird names of the people who were living there, is there anything about human being names? I mean, people names? Is that changing or anything?
Well, you're asking two questions. One is the native language of birds. Like, for example, Audubon went around North America, and he never used the native names that were given to these same birds. Whatever the native people knew was generally disregarded. We're starting to do that in Hawaii, for example, where we have Hawaiian names for using the Hawaiian native names for a lot of the Hawaiian species. But in general, the white settlers were not familiar with the native languages that were spoken in a lot of these areas. There's a whole field of anthropology that can get into this, but let me just go on about naming something after a person. So let me talk about Sabin's gull, if that's an example of what you mean.
And we'll have to be brief.
I'm sorry.
A couple of minutes left. That's okay.
Okay. The guy who described it named it after his brother. And you're not supposed to name a bird after yourself. That is one of the unwritten rules of zoological nomenclature. So he named it after his brother who collected the first specimen. So
who happened to have the same name.
He happens to have the same name as the guy who described the Sabin's gull as new to science. So that's how he got around that. But that's a rare kind of a thing.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Joseph, for having been on the show today. And I really appreciate your being here. And I want to thank also our sponsors and the DVE store. So special thanks to them. And also thank you for listening. I really appreciate your joining us on these shows. And if you have any comments or questions or anything like that, you can always reach us at our website. That's where all of this is archived, and there's forms there where you can send us information. So that is birdingwithlois.global. So I guess that's the end of our show, Joseph. So maybe we should just say goodbye to everybody. And
thank you for having me.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.